Okay, thanks everyone for joining the team today, representing bdhSterling as we present to you a great session outlining how to unlock the potential of your UK pension in Australia. Today, we'll take you through some general information around making use of pension funds for your future retirement by covering off areas such as types of pensions and when and how you could look to transfer. What is a QROPS? What is a QROPS fund? How we try and make the transfer process simple and easy, and how bdhSterling is set up to assist. So today, the presentation is very much information only. So before we begin, we'll just take you through a quick information only slide. Just get that to transfer on through. Hopefully that should pop up on the screen. So then anything we talk about today is information only. The presentation is based on Australian and UK legislation as at the 10th of July 2023 and is general information only. It's not tailored to advice specific to your situation. So before acting on any information contained in today's session, we'd encourage you to seek tailored financial advice specific to your needs. So today's presenters, my name is Brenton Ritchie. I'm the Financial Planning Manager for the Australian division of our business. I'll help to introduce and facilitate today's session and help with the Q&A at the end. The most important person today is Nick Bond, who's a Senior Financial Planner from our Sydney office. Nick's been with bdhSterling since the beginning days and has over 15 years experience in the financial planning industry and providing advice to UK and Australian clients across a broad range of advice and strategies with deep technical knowledge around today's topic of unlocking the full potential of your pension funds in Australia. Be that a successful transfer of your pension or making use of the funds as part of the overall advice strategy, Nick will take us through the main content you'll need to know about transferring pensions into Australia in 2023. Just see if we can keep these slides going through. So today's agenda, so we've broken the agenda today into 5 key areas: the types of pensions and why to transfer, QROPS, so what is a qualifying recognised overseas pension scheme, the transfer process, what it takes to transfer across and why advice is important, and where bdhSterling can assist. Towards the end, we'll go through a Q&A session, and we'll certainly look to answer as many questions as we can at the end, so please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section and we'll try and answer as many as possible. So you'll see on your screen, you'll have a chat and a Q&A. I think there's one in there already. If we don't get through all the questions, we'll certainly come back individually or as a group as we can to answer any specific questions post the session. So let's get started, and we will get started with the first section, which is types of pensions and why to transfer with Nick.
Thanks, everybody, for attending and welcome. Brenton, just before we start, I can't start my video from my end.
Okay, all right, I'll help you with that. If you want to jump in, I'll do that from here.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, starting off, what types of UK pensions can be transferred? So there are some that can't, but there are plenty that can. So ones that can be transferred are company pensions. So you would have worked for employers, and some of those employers would have joined you up to their company pension schemes. You may also have taken out a private pension, whereby you contributed to that scheme. And another popular one is funded public sector defined benefit schemes, or final salary schemes, as you may know them. What can't be transferred? So the UK state pension, so that's the pension that you've accrued by making national insurance contributions. That can't be physically swapped over to Australia, but you'll still be able to receive the income from that. Sorry, Brenton, that's in front of the slide there.
Sorry.
So yes, government unfunded pensions. Now, there was a big change a number of years ago from the UK government that meant final salary schemes such as the NHS, the Army, police, teachers, a number of other government unfunded schemes could not be transferred. There are still a couple of funded government schemes that are able to be transferred. Any defined benefit schemes that have fallen into the pension protection fund, once they're in there, they can't be transferred across. Any pensions that are already in payment, whether that be a final salary scheme or a group personal pension, if they're in payment or have an annuity attached to them. So a final salary scheme will have an annual payment. Some personal pensions will have an annuity. They can't be transferred, but those that are already in payment and are in drawdown, personal pensions can be. Okay, on to the next slide, please. I can't control that. There we go, thanks. So what are the types of company pensions? So you've got defined contribution. That will be similar to most people's superannuation schemes that they may be familiar with over here, or to throw a few familiar UK names out, Aviva, Prudential, companies like that you may have been familiar with. They're normally defined contribution schemes whereby the amount that gets paid in, any growth and investment growth that's accumulated, that's ultimately your fund value, and that will vary on a day-to-day basis. Defined benefit schemes, they are similar to an annuity where you'll have a pension income that's been promised to you and guaranteed to you upon retirement. So that's the two major types of pension schemes. Okay, so why would you consider transferring your UK pension? There's a number of reasons which I'll run through. One that's what we feel is very important is the currency side of things. So if you're drawing a pension income in pounds and you're living in Australia, you're going to be ultimately spending most of your money in Australian dollars. So that fluctuating currency rate will have quite a big effect on the amount that you end up converting into dollars. So we like to work with certainty as financial planners and know the amount that you've got, rather than being in the hands of the gods as to what the exchange rate will do over time. And you can see this is quite a prolonged graph there, nearly 50 years. The rates are recorded. This graph is actually a 5-year graph showing you the high of $2.05 in the past 5 years, which was just pre-COVID, and we've had some lows as well, down to 167, and I've seen huge fluctuations from $1.45 to $2.70 over the last 15 or so years. So it's an ever-moving target, and there is good cause to take that currency risk out. Estate planning. So for final salary schemes or defined benefit schemes, typically 50% of the members' entitlement passes on to beneficiaries, normally a spouse. If children are under 23 and in full-time education, there can be benefits for children, but typically there's not a great benefit for the children. And often final salary schemes face difficulty funding those particular schemes due to the fact they're very expensive to run, hence why they're no longer offered in the private sector, and that company is bound to pay into that scheme. So sometimes some of these schemes run into difficulty, and there can be a funding deficit, which can affect you down the line if that pension fund does fall into the pension protection fund, because your pension could be reduced by 10% or so. Investment control. So in terms of a personal pension, you will have selected certain assets and different sectors, and you'll be familiar, some of you, with your super funds, whereby a default fund that you may go into is a balance fund, for example, and that may or may not be appropriate for you. However, you'll have a lot more control by looking at coming out of, for example, a defined benefit scheme, whereby you can choose how much or how little risk you take, and it's just a bit, just a bit more control for you there. tax treatment. This is a pretty big one. Depending on your retirement age and the meeting condition of release here, you can access super from 0% tax rate. So it's very advantageous as opposed to the UK, whereby if you draw that income from a UK pension scheme, you'll be taxed at firstly UK marginal rates, or if you've elected to pay the tax in Australia, or Australian marginal tax rates. Only the growth of that fund, if you do end up transferring, only the growth of that fund since your date of arrival is actually taxed when it comes to Australia. So if you've been here 20, 30 years, there might be a fair amount of growth. But if you've been here a couple of years, then that growth portion will be smaller. The tax rate is pretty minimal. So the benefit largely is to get it over here and benefit from tax-free drawdown from your super. Also, you can consolidate pension funds, so you're not having 3 or 4 schemes that you're being charged fees from, and invest those in line with your attitude to risk as well. So why would you not transfer? There are a number of reasons to do it, which we just covered, but a couple of the reasons, big reasons for not doing it. It might not always be cost effective. So depending on the size of your fund, even with the benefit of being able to draw it out tax-free from Australia, there's still cost involved in moving it across. So it may not be beneficial to do so, even when factoring in the tax element of it. The current UK scheme might be great. You might be getting fantastic returns, which we may not be able to match over here in Australia. Some schemes in the UK may also charge early exit penalties, which will ultimately reduce the value of your pension scheme. And some people will not be comfortable transferring, particularly from a defined benefit scheme, transferring from having no market risk, where they've got a guaranteed pension income, to having to invest that money to try and generate a return, which typically means investing in the markets. So that people, if they haven't had that experience in the past, may not feel comfortable in doing so. So what are the options for people living in Australia? So for those aged under 55, that is the number, or the age, I should say, that you're allowed to transfer to Australia. So those that are under 55 still have options that we can put funds, we can consolidate funds in the UK, we can transfer defined benefit schemes into what's called a SIPP, a self-invested personal pension, or a private pension. And within that SIPP, we also have the ability to look at the currency side of things as well, and take that future currency risk out pre the transfer to Australia. Or simply leave it where it is, if that makes sense to do so, and that's the best outcome for the client, then yeah, that's a reasonable option as well. So what is a SIPP? A SIPP is a self-invested personal pension fund. It's a pension scheme in the UK, regulated pension scheme, and it affords you a bit more flexibility than a typical personal pension will do. And there's a diverse investment solutions, and yeah, it's very similar to what some people may know here, an SMSF, a self-managed super fund, whereby it gives you a bit more flexibility, and you're in a bit more control of that SIPP, that self-invested personal pension. So benefits, as I mentioned just then, the assets can be held in pounds or in dollars, and also can be invested in pounds or dollars. That's quite key, particularly at the moment with the exchange rate where it's currently at. It's at a reasonable level. It's over the 10-year average. So for those that are under 55 and want to take that currency risk out, they can buy the Australian dollars and invest in an Australian dollar denominated portfolio. Within that SIPP as well, the benefits, so the fund value, if someone were to pass away pre-75, 100% of that fund passes on to the beneficiary. Whereas if you're, for example, in a defined benefit scheme and there's a spouse's pension, typically, as I mentioned before, only 50% of that fund value will pass on to the spouse. So that's quite an attractive option there for some people as well. And yeah, you can have as much input into that investment philosophy as you wish. Some people may choose to make their own investments and yeah, look after the investment strategy. We also offer that service, and we will look to see what risk is appropriate for you to take based on your attitude to risk, based on conversations, based on goals and objectives, and how long to the transfer over to Australia will be. Okay, so the transfer options for those that are 55 and over. So it must be, well, a UK pension must be transferred to a QROPS when it's leaving the UK and going overseas. So QROPS is a qualifying recognised overseas pension scheme. So that's the HMRC piece that we need to be aware of and comply with. We've also then have the Australian non-concessional contribution limits that we must adhere to, that allows only a certain amount of that fund to come over at one time. So some people may be in a nice position where they're over that non-concessional cap, and may need to leave some behind and transfer the balances in subsequent tax years. Or alternatively, again, like I said before, you can leave that fund in the UK if that's the most appropriate thing for your circumstances. Okay, so more detail on the QROPS now. So, yep, as I mentioned, QROPS, Qualifying Recognised Overseas Pension Scheme. It was introduced by the government in 2006, and it basically dictates what can and can't be done when pensions are transferred outside of the UK. There's quite a strict criteria that a QROPS scheme must meet in order for it to be become a QROPS. The HMRC vet every QROPS scheme and make sure trustees comply with their requirements. So yeah, it's a good option for those that have left the UK permanently, not intending to return back to the UK, have built up their UK pension fund, and want to transfer that to the country that they reside in. So it creates a lot more flexibility for those that have moved overseas. So QROPS is fairly complex. There's Australia's not the only jurisdiction that QROPS funds exist in. There are a number of jurisdictions, and with that comes complexity and legislation changes. These are a few of the headline changes over the past few years. So in April 2015, as I touched on before, the government made some pretty big changes to allowing transfers out of defined benefit schemes that were unfunded. As I mentioned, NHS, police, those types of schemes, teachers. They also introduced at the same time the pension age test, and what that meant is that it inadvertently affected the Australian QROPS system most of the super funds in Australia prior to that point in April were QROPS schemes and able to accept overseas transfers. But a tweak to the rules meant that they no longer complied, and they had to be removed from that QROPS list. And as a result, there's now only a couple of options QROPS wise that are available to people in Australia. The FCA also introduced, the Financial Conduct Authority who govern us, also introduced that for defined benefit schemes, final salary schemes, anyone with a transfer value of over £30,000 has to have advice from a qualified licensed advisor with the relevant permissions to give pension transfer advice on defined benefit schemes. In March 2017, there was a 25% tax charge introduced for transfers to different jurisdictions to those that the person resided in. For example, if you were living in Australia and wanted to transfer your pension to New Zealand for whatever reason, you could do that prior to March 2017, but post that, if someone transfers that UK scheme to a jurisdiction that they don't live in, there's a 25% tax charge on the entire fund. In July 2017, Australia reduced contribution caps fairly significantly, which meant that less money could come over in one go, which results in people having to phase transfers or transfer in tranches. So what are the benefits of a QROPS? If you do transfer your fund, you'll have your super or pension fund in the jurisdiction that you're living in, which is very convenient. People, believe it or not, often lose track of their pension funds from a UK perspective if they've lived over here for a long while. So it's much easier from an administration perspective to have them in the country that you're residing in. The pension can be denominated in pounds or dollars, so that makes it flexible if people still need or want pounds for whatever reason. 100% of the pension passes to your dependent if you pass away. Again, you can lose up to 50% of the value of the annual pension from a defined benefit scheme should you pass away and be in receipt of that pension. The tax treatment, this don't want to go on about it too much, but the tax treatment is really favourable. So if you were in the UK and you've built up your UK pension fund, you will have actually received tax relief on that in the UK from the UK government, because they're thinking that they're going to get the tax back when you draw it, because when you draw down your pension, that income is taxed in the UK. But if you're transferring it over to Australia, the growth is the piece that is taxable by the Australian government, and the rest of the fund, when you're drawing it and you meet a condition of release here in Australia, you're drawing that out completely tax-free. And yes, again, from an administration perspective, you can have one super or pension fund as opposed to a couple in the UK, a couple over here. It makes life a lot easier to A, plan, but B, look after and keep an eye on and understand exactly what your retirement savings look like. So yeah, the QROPS schemes do have responsibilities. It is governed by HMRC, and not just any old pension company or super fund can become a QROPS scheme. So there are quite strict rules that need to be adhered to. These are the headline points to note. So the scheme, that QROPS scheme, must report back to HMRC for 10 years from the date of that transfer. So yeah, the trustee of the scheme must make sure that any reportable events are reported to HMRC within a timely fashion. The benefits that are received over here must be broadly in line with the UK pension scheme provisions. So some things are excluded from UK pensions, for example, property, and the QROPS scheme needs to follow those rules. And the scheme must comply with the member payment provision period, so that you have to stick to the rules in regards to when pensions can be accessed, and not leaving the country as well, that you've transferred into is another one that's pretty big. If you move your fund to Australia and you were to leave within the member payment provision period, which is 5 years from the date of transfer, then there can be some pretty hefty tax bill on the entire fund of 25%. So that's important that those rules are adhered to and understood before the transfer to a QROPS fund is commenced. Okay, right, the transfer process. So that's the general outline of what's involved, what can and can't be transferred, and the mechanics behind it. But what is the actual transfer process, and how do BDH go about it? So initially, we would have a meeting to determine whether or not it's in your interest to work with us, and if there's value that we can add to your situation. So there's no cost for that initial meeting. So yes, if you've got a pension fund, it's worth exploring in the first instance if it's a suitable thing for us to look into. So we will then, post that meeting, be able to ascertain whether or not it is something for us to help you with and assist you with, and importantly, whether there's value in it for you. If you decide to go ahead with us on that journey, the first stage is for us to complete a pension transfer analysis report. So that report, we will cover off all the pension schemes you've got in the UK, whether that's 1, 2, 5, however many schemes is there, and we will determine whether or not that a transfer is in your best interest. So if it's not, we will be upfront and tell you and the reasons why you shouldn't transfer that. But if it is beneficial to transfer, then we will also go on to explain the real finer detail and the mechanics behind how that transfer out of the UK scheme, original UK scheme, takes place. And then how we may utilise that SIPP that I spoke of earlier to consolidate the UK funds into, take that currency risk out, and then use that for the onward transfer to Australia when the age requirement is met. You don't have to transfer at 55. You can transfer after that period, but we always will advise people to transfer sooner rather than later, just in case UK regulation changes. We saw a few slides earlier that the UK government brought in some changes over the years, and that could happen moving forward. So it's always best to take advantage of the current rules if you're in a position to be able to do so. We will fully go through that report with you, explain all the recommendations, the what's, whys, hows, and do's and don'ts, and importantly, what that cost will be for the transfer, and also what the end cost will be to move it to Australia as well. So the pension transfer report will give you the recommendations of the yes or no and how we go about it. And then you've got the option of engaging us further for the implementation and the management of that quite complex process. But again, we will let you know in that report if the recommendation is yes to transfer. We will explain what all those pieces are. Okay, next one, please, Betsy. Okay, so yeah, why is it important to get our advice? Not only is it mandatory for those that have got a defined benefit scheme that's over £30,000, but for those that don't have that restriction, it's still very important to get the right advice. There's lots of we're working with two tax offices, and there's a number of changes that go on during the course of the years, and getting the right strategy can save you time and potentially money. In terms of getting it really wrong, if you fail to comply with QROPS rules and you were to inadvertently transfer it to a non-QROPS pension fund, there are penalties of up to 55% of the fund value that could be applied by HMRC. And yeah, again, reiterating, confirming if that actual pension is transferable, if it is suitable to transfer. Okay.
Okay, I will jump back in, guys, and try and get my video up and running as well. Why bdhSterling? Great question to ask, and certainly some great reasons of why bdhSterling is a company that can assist with pension advice as to whether you can or can't transfer your pension outside of the UK. So we are one of the only places in Australia with dual licensed advisors. So we have a team of advisors who, some of those are not only accredited in UK as UK advisors, pension transfer specialists, but we have obviously advisors who are fully qualified in Australia under ASIC and ASIC's guidelines as well. Defined benefit scheme specialists, we've certainly been playing in the space of defined benefits for many years now, and certainly hold a great deal of confidence in the advice that we give there around defined benefit schemes, which are certainly complex from a UK point of view. Advice under one roof. So certainly from exposure within Australia, we have offices in Perth, Sydney, where Nick is, Melbourne and Queensland, and obviously our main office in the UK as well. So it's certainly a great deal of ability and experience within the team across those areas and jurisdictions. We're able to provide advice in other financial services as well. So Australian superannuation, certainly with the team within Australia. Tax advice, we do have BDH Tax, which is certainly a partner of the team. Risk advice, we do some of that internally, and we also do have a specialist partner from an external point of view that we liaise with there. And retirement planning, certainly one of the reasons of bringing pension funds outside of the UK and across to Australia is for what those lifestyle goals, needs, objectives are around retirement planning. As we mentioned earlier, Nick has been one of the inaugural members of bdhSterling, certainly brings a lot of that experience into what he does day in, day out with clients. But bdhSterling has been operating for that 15-year time frame as well. So certainly well established in this space. So if you want to talk to a financial planner, you can certainly email through to inquiries@bdhsterling.com and send us an email with age, what you're looking to achieve, bit of broad retirement plan, bit of information about yourself, and we can certainly look to see how we can assist from there. So Q&As, I might stop sharing screen for a little bit as we go through the Q&As, because technology's not necessarily been best friend just now. For Q&As, we do have On your screen there, you'll have down the bottom chat, polls, Q&A box. So in the Q&A box, please put your questions in there. There's a couple in there already, but feel free to type your questions into that Q&A section and we'll try and answer as many as possible. Any questions we don't get through, we'll certainly come back and answer specific questions post the webinar. But before we jump into a couple of those questions, certainly thanks to Nick for the presentation there of taking us through those steps. So the first question, and certainly this is definitely a yes answer, will a recording be available after the event? Yes, there will certainly be a recording. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, we'll send through a copy of the recording to each individual that has attended today. Question that is there a minimum amount that can be transferred to Australia? Nick, I might give that one to you if you want to give a bit of background on what could be transferred and how, and maybe even timeframes. That may answer some further questions that come through.
Yeah, so there's no minimum per se. However, there would be an amount where it would be cost prohibitive to transfer across, because you've got scheme fees, you've got the advice fees. So the answer to it is no, but yes, in reality, there needs to be a minimum level to make it worth your while to move that across and have the advice from us on that. In terms of timescales and timeframes for a defined benefit scheme, we have to gather an incredible amount of information and carry out some pretty complex analysis. So that takes a fair bit of time. With a defined contribution scheme, typically we get the information relatively quickly. I say relatively because that can vary from a month to 3 or so months. But we still have to carry out that analysis. So in terms of timescales from signing up with us to getting the report, we could be anywhere from 2 to 6 months. 6 months would be quite a long time frame, but yeah, typically 2 to 3 months. We'd like to have that advice out to you. In terms of timeframes on the transfer, again, that can be somewhat elongated. The UK regulations in recent years have tightened, and there's a lot more red tape to get through, a lot more hoops to jump through, so that the time frame for actually physically getting out of your scheme and getting that over to Australia, or getting out of your scheme and into an alternative UK scheme, can again be anywhere from 2 to 6 months to get that process completed.
Perfect, thanks, Nick. The next question, probably a two-part question, so we'll answer that as best we can. So the first bit was hinted at transferring in tranches from a SIPP to a QROPS. So there are requirements. Nick touched on a little bit in the presentation around what's referred to as NCCs, non-concessional contributions. So there's limits of how much fund from a UK pension can be transferred into the Australian superannuation environment at any point in time. We've got strategies of what we can do to try and maximise that within those limits, and also some things which we can do around that, around some other sort of lump sum payments that can be done at the time of transferring across as well. So if it was, say, just for ease of figures, an under $300,000 amount, there's every potential we could do a transfer of that in one hit. Amounts above that would be potentially over a 2-year period of time, or larger amounts would be, we have some clients who will take us a 7+ year time frame to get the bulk of their funds across, just depending on those fund balances. The second part of that question was around if the transfer is in tranches, can there be a mixture of Australian dollars and Great British pounds? The answer to that is yes. You can hold different currency within the UK SIPP, and there's different abilities there prior to transfer and whatnot of what you can do too. So it depends on a lot of different factors, and certainly that would be something which Nick and the advising team would talk to you about. What is it you're looking to achieve? How would that play out, and what would be the steps and timeframes that would take to do that? And that would be part of the advice process we would take you through as a potential client. Nick, question for yourself. Can you transfer an AVC?
Yes, you can. Yeah, typically an AVC will be linked to a defined benefit scheme. So yes, you can normally transfer that AVC independently from the defined benefit scheme, but some schemes occasionally don't allow you to do that. But typically, yes, you can. You can transfer an additional voluntary contribution. Yes.
Perfect. This question is: after transferring to a QROPS, will it transfer to an Australia super fund eventually? The technical aspect of that is the Australian super fund would need a QROPS designation from HMRC, and so there are a small number of possible options for that. Typically, then it would stay in a QROPS designated fund until there are conditions that have met to release it from a QROPS designation, or things transpire, you've met the abilities and take a lump sum withdrawal, and therefore the QROPS is no longer needed from there. But technically, the Australian fund would have I guess you can call it a side designation of being a QROPS eligible fund at that point in time. Nick, this question I might throw to you. Sometime back in the UK, there was an option to pay part of government pension into a SIPP. Can this be transferred to Australia?
Yes, SIRPs, or as it was called, opting out of that part of the government pension would have, your payments, instead of going to the government, would have gone into a private pension scheme. And yes, that can be transferred over very similarly to how a UK private pension would come across. So yes, if you did opt out previously, then you're able to transfer that over to Australia once you're 55 or over.
Yep, perfect. Nick, this is a bit of a scenario one. Let's say, for instance, if I had £300,000, is it possible to divide that 50-50 to retain half in the UK and transfer half across to Australia?
Yes, absolutely. Whilst there's limits on the amount that you can or allowed to remit to Australia, you can transfer as much up to that limit as you like, and you can leave some behind in the UK. Whether that's the right thing to do or not is another question. If you're transferring some over, and that's been the advice, it would probably be unlikely that you keep some behind, but you definitely can, absolutely. So yes, that's certainly possible.
Thanks, Nick. This is an interesting topic, this one, and it will probably branch out into two types of answers from this. So let's say one of the transfer processes or moving process of coming across to Australia is around visas. If you're applying for a permanent visa at the moment, can you transfer your pension funds across? I might get Nick to elaborate, but I'll make the first comment. Temporary visa holders is a very, very cautious area for us, and we really, if you're a temporary visa holder, we wouldn't be looking to transfer. There are a lot of pitfalls for that, and we would really be making sure there was a permanent visa arrangement and an applicable visa that allowed that to happen. But Nick, I might get you to talk a little bit more around some of the residency and timeframe requirements, because there is a second question which follows along around that same theme of how long would it remain in a QROPS before access would become available to a degree.
Yeah, certainly. So yes, as Brenton alluded to there, whilst you could transfer on a temporary visa, or whilst you waited for permanent residency, it would be very unlikely that that would be the recommendation that we would make, due to largely the fact of if you are either not resident and not a permanent resident but a temporary visa holder, there's restrictions on accessing super. So you could get yourself in the situation where you've transferred your UK pension over here, you're ready to retire post 60, and you want to access that money. If you're still on a temporary visa, then you wouldn't be able to access that super fund. And yeah, worst case scenario, that you didn't get the visa and had to return back to the UK, you'll have transferred that over to Australia, incurred a cost, incurred fees and potential taxes along the way, not getting the benefit of what the Australian superannuation system offers. So yes, it would be whilst it wouldn't be a carte blanche, no, it wouldn't happen. It would need to be quite extenuating circumstances for us to look at transferring for someone whilst they're on a temporary visa.
And Nick, you mentioned in the presentation around, say if I left Australia again, can I leave Australia for a holiday and not incur the 25% tax that you mentioned before, which is a little bit scary? What's my abilities to come and go there?
Yep, a holiday's fine, an even extended holiday. But if you were leaving Australia from a residency perspective, i.e., it was no longer going to be your home, the place that you were living, and you're within that 5-year period, then there would be the tax applied, the 25% tax charge on the amount that you transferred across. But the long holidays and spending 3 months overseas and different circumstances like that are absolutely fine. It's leaving the country. And the reason it's there is to stop people transferring it out of the UK to a very favourable tax jurisdiction to withdraw their funds or have them over there and then leave that jurisdiction and have got their funds out probably largely tax free.
Another sort of scenario question, Nick, probably referring to a little bit around a PCLS there. If we draw down our 25% of our UK pension pot now tax-free, can we transfer the rest over to the Oz QROPS scheme? Understanding the transfer limit annually is around £60,000. Is that correct?
So yes and no. And what I mean by that is
the value of advice coming in there.
Yes. So it's going to depend on the fund size that you have in the UK and what's being crystallised, as we call it. If you do draw your 25% of the full value and you fully crystallise that pension pot, you lose the ability to make partial transfers. So if you're going to need to do those transfers in tranches because you're over caps and can't make bigger tranches, then if you've crystallized that entire fund, you can't split that up and send 100 1 year or 150 the next year. You're not able to do that. So yes, you can, but no, it's not advisable to do that. It makes it a hell of a lot more challenging. If the fund size is smaller, then yes, that can be done. But then there are tax consequences. Whilst that lump sum 25% is tax-free from a UK perspective, depending on what actions you've taken up to the point of taking that 25%, there could be tax applied by the ATO on that lump sum. So yes, again, that's the value of seeking advice, making sure that you're doing the right thing and not going to get a nasty shock when you fill in the tax return.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll segue to another sort of scenario that's come through as well. The scenario, to summarize a little bit, it's around potential of, am I going to stay in Australia or am I going to go back to the UK? Where do I see myself staying longer term, and what do I do from there? I think that's the value of talking to Nick and the broader team around what are the scenarios that may apply for you. As lifestyle changes and time goes on, and what that might mean on tax of transferring out of Australia back to the UK. What are the timeframes? So there's certainly some aspects in some of the scenarios that come through there where chatting to the team, seeking advice, getting the right sort of answers, direction, and putting the right strategies in place is really, really appropriate to make sure you do the right steps as it goes through. Again, we talk a little bit about, in some things in life, with the right assets to the right people at the right time with the right tax benefits. Again, seeking that advice helps those things to come into play. More money in your pocket for retirement is certainly beneficial for you and what you want to achieve. Nick, I might do a really quick one. We've touched on it a couple of times, but maybe even if you want to build it into a bit of a scenario, but the transfer process and the time it takes, from coming from a SIPP in the UK or from a PTR to getting into a SIPP in the UK to getting across into a QROPS, a bit of a timescale there of how long that typically takes, all things going to plan.
Yep. So a defined benefit scheme is going to ordinarily take longer than a defined contribution scheme, but to prepare that report, typically 2 to 3 months. Once we gathered all the information and carried out the analysis and written that report. Defined benefit schemes actually have a window of 3 months in which to make your decision whether or not you're going to transfer out once you've got a guaranteed value from them. So we'll ensure that's met. So let's say typically 3 months, for 2 to 3 months for that initial pension report from engagement. Then if you decide that you want to transfer it, if we're moving it into an interim scheme in the UK first, that will take anywhere from 1 month to 3 months typically. There are obviously some outliers there, and I've got some that have taken 6 to 9 months previously from defined benefit schemes. So yeah, 2 to 3 months to get it into the interim scheme in the UK. If you're then at that point 55 or over, and we're starting to look at the transfer to Australia, we need to have the scheme set up over here in which to transfer into. But we can do that at the same time as we're transferring out of that UK scheme into the interim scheme. But that will take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to set the receiving scheme up. And then the physical transfer from the UK scheme to the Australian scheme, as I mentioned, it's become a bit more heavily regulated now, a lot more red tape to cut through. So that can take anywhere from the scheme being in receipt of the forms to releasing the funds to the super fund. That can be anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks, depending on workloads. It's very niche what we do. It's very complicated, and there's only a limited number of companies that we trust with these overseas transfers to be carried out, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So we are limited by the amount of schemes that we can use, and they have a certain capacity level which we have to be cognizant of. So yes, depending on how busy things are and they are at the time, probably 2 to 3 months realistically to get it out of that UK scheme to the old scheme.
Perfect. Thanks again, Nick. The last question we've got here, and really, really valid question. It's around what do we charge for our services? What does it cost to receive advice to transfer funds? We don't want to hide from this, because certainly it's an important thing to understand. It's not a simple, easy process, and certainly there's a lot of things which we need to make sure we do to make sure any advice that we give is in the best interest of a client. To give you an idea, first off, we may actually advise you to not transfer the pension, as Nick's alluded to a few times. It may be in your better interest to leave that pension in the UK and then determine the access of funds along the way through your greater goals, needs and objectives. So if we're looking at a pension transfer advice report, we'd certainly be looking at a fee for that. And to give you an idea, that'd be a £3,000 fee for all the research, all the advice interaction piece that goes into letting you know what you can and can't do, what are the abilities that you do have with that pension. To go past that point, if it is able to be transferred, we'd certainly take you through at that point in time. Obviously, as Nick and I have mentioned, there is a fair bit of complexity into how much you can bring across, what sort of steps and stages it brings across, and that's different from person to person. So to give anything here, it'd just be a ballpark. So I think if you engage, we can sit down, talk about what the needs are, what the steps would be, and we can certainly, before we look to undertake any work, give you that to make sure you're comfortable and understanding of what that would take to proceed and go ahead from there. All right, we are a couple of minutes before time, so to recap, thanks very much everyone for attending today and taking some time out of your day to come along and listen to Nick and myself take you through today's session. We trust it's been a worthwhile session and the information has been useful for you. A recording of the session will be forwarded to you over the next 48 hours, and we'll reach out direct if you had any other specific questions as they came through. Certainly encourage you to please keep an eye out for the feedback survey as it comes out. Your time has been greatly appreciated today, and your time by giving us some feedback there to help us with what we've delivered and things which you may see as valuable for us to be able to provide as a service, would be certainly grateful there. So that'll come out very, very shortly from surveymonkey.co.uk. For those who are looking to seek advice on what your situation may allow, please feel free to reach out. That email address again, inquiries@bdhsterling.com. And once again, on behalf of Nick, myself and the team at bdhSterling, thank you very much for your time today.